I spent 22 years being called a failure by my own family. 22 years of silence, rejection, and being erased from every holiday, every celebration, every moment that mattered. But sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing at the most unexpected moments, like when your father's boss discovers exactly who his disappointment of a daughter really is. What happened next didn't just change how my family saw me, it changed everything. This is the story of how I went from being the daughter who threw her life away to the woman who finally came home on her own terms. You don't belong here, Beth. Maggie wouldn't have wanted you at her funeral. Those were the first words my father spoke to me in 22 years. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the uniform I wore, no recognition that I'd flown halfway across the country to say goodbye to the woman who gave me life. Just a cold, final sentence delivered in the pale morning light outside St. Mary's Chapel. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, still adjusting to civilian ground beneath my feet after the red-eye flight from Fort Leonard Wood. The heels of my dress, blue Oxfords, felt rooted to the concrete, and my white-gloved hand clutched the small black purse that held her old rosary, the same one she used to keep on the kitchen windowsill when I was little, the one I'd carried through 3 deployments like a talisman. I hadn't even made it to the church steps when he intercepted me. Robert Morrison, my father still broad-shouldered at 65, still carrying that same hard-set jawline he'd always turned on me when I disagreed with him. Only now his temples were completely white, and his posture leaned slightly to the left, arthritis probably from 40 years of construction work. But his voice hadn't changed. Cold, final, like a door I'd been trying to open since I was 17. "I came to honor Mom," I said, quietly proud that my voice didn't shake. 22 years of military bearing had taught me to stand tall even when everything inside me wanted to crumble. "Whether you like it or not." He turned his back on me, then the same way he had the morning I left for basic training. But this time I didn't watch him walk away. This time I walked toward the chapel doors, my spine straight, my shoulders squared, ready to face whatever waited inside. The chapel doors closed behind me with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Every head in the room turned toward me, some quickly looking away, others staring with undisguised curiosity. I recognized maybe a third of the faces, church ladies with their pursed lips and white gloves folded in their laps, my father's co-workers from Morrison construction neighbors who'd watched me grow up but now looked at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong service. I walked down the center aisle with measured steps, my military bearing automatic after 2 decades of formal ceremonies. Mom's photograph sat beside the altar, her eyes crinkled in that familiar smile I remembered, holding a tray of her famous lemon bars, her apron still dusted with flour. My chest tightened at the sight. I found an empty seat in the back row. No one slid over to make room. No one even nodded in acknowledgement, not even Uncle Dave, who used to sneak me peppermints during long Sunday services when I was 8 years old. Now he sat 3 rows ahead, his shoulders rigid pointedly, not turning around. The service began with a hymn I didn't remember, followed by words from Pastor Williams about eternal rest and God's plan. Then my father stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat as he unfolded a piece of paper with careful hands. "Margaret Morrison was a pillar of this community," he began, his voice steady and controlled. He talked about her loyalty to the church, her dedication to family traditions, her pride in the Morrison legacy, builders of things that last. He said the same phrase he'd used to describe our family since I was old enough to understand it. He spoke about David's construction company, about how proud Mom was of her 2 grandsons, about the way she'd light up when they visited on weekends. His voice wavered slightly when he mentioned how she'd always have fresh cookies waiting. But here's what nobody in that room knew, including my father, was who I really was. And in just a few hours, one man would change everything. He never said my name. Not once. It wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate erasure, as clean and precise as a military operation. 22 years of service, 3 deployments, a Bronze Star for valor, and I might as well have never existed. I gripped the funeral program so tightly that my white gloves began to strain at the seams. My lungs felt compressed against my ribs like I was wearing body armor that was too tight. The familiar symptoms of a panic attack crept up my spine, the ones I'd learned to manage during firefights, but somehow couldn't control in a peaceful chapel. As the service continued, I found myself thinking about the last real conversation I'd had with Mom. It was through a shaky voicemail while I was stationed in Qatar. "Hey baby, I know we haven't talked much, but I'm proud of you." That was it. 4 years ago. The last time I heard her voice. After the closing prayer, people began filing out in small groups, murmuring condolences to David and pointedly avoiding eye contact with me. I remained seated, not ready to face the receiving line, not ready for the awkward conversations that would follow. As I sat in that back pew, listening to my father erase me from Mom's story, I had no idea that his boss was about to walk through those chapel doors and everything I thought I knew about my family was about to shatter. The receiving line moved slowly, a parade of familiar faces, offering rehearsed condolences to my father and David while carefully avoiding my corner of the chapel. I watched from my back pew as the community that had once known me as Bobby Morrison's youngest daughter now treated me like an unwelcome stranger. That's when he walked in, a man in an expensive charcoal suit, confident stride, the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. He scanned the crowd until his eyes found my father near the front of the chapel. "Bob," he said, approaching with an extended hand. "Jim Patterson, Regional Director. I'm sorry for your loss." My father straightened immediately, his posture shifting to the deferential stance he'd always adopted around authority figures. "Mr. Patterson, thank you for coming to Margaret's service." I watched this interaction from the back, curious about who could command such immediate respect from the man who'd spent 40 years commanding respect from everyone else. Jim Patterson looked like corporate leadership, polished, articulate, probably made more in a year than Dad made in 5. Jim's gaze swept the room and landed on me. His eyes moved from my face to my uniform, taking in the dress blues, the insignia, the bearing that 22 years of military service had given me. His expression shifted from polite sympathy to genuine surprise. "Morrison," he said slowly, reading my name tape. His voice carried across the now quiet chapel. "Colonel Morrison." The conversations around us died. Every head turned toward the back of the room where I sat. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice carrying the crisp authority that came naturally after 2 decades of command. "Well, I'll be damned." A smile spread across Jim's face, and he began walking toward me, leaving my father standing alone near the altar. "Bob, you didn't tell me your daughter was Colonel Morrison." The silence in the chapel was deafening. I could see confusion rippling through the crowd, could feel my father's shock from 30 feet away. "I've been trying to recruit you for 6 months through proper channels," Jim continued, now standing directly in front of me. "Your work on the Bagram infrastructure project was legendary, and the cybersecurity framework you developed, we're implementing a version of it across all our international operations." Mrs. Henderson from the church choir stepped closer, her expression shifting from polite sympathy to genuine curiosity. "Jim, when you say legendary..." Colonel Morrison designed and supervised the construction of water treatment facilities that serve 40,000 personnel and Afghan civilians, Jim explained to the growing crowd. "Under fire, I might add, she earned a Bronze Star for valor when her convoy was attacked during a site inspection." A murmur went through the chapel. I saw Uncle Dave's eyebrows rise, saw my sister-in-law Karen's grip on David's arm loosen slightly. These were people who'd known me as the rebellious Morrison girl who'd run off to join the army against her father's wishes. Now they were learning I was someone important enough that corporate directors actively pursued my expertise. "Then there's her work on military communications security," Jim continued, apparently enjoying his role as my unofficial publicist. "The cyber protocols she developed are now standard across NATO operations in the Middle East. We're talking about protecting communications for hundreds of thousands of service members." "Cybersecurity." My father's voice was barely audible from across the room. "Cutting-edge stuff." Jim nodded enthusiastically. She holds a master's degree from Georgia Tech, earned it while serving, by the way. Her thesis on infrastructure vulnerability assessment became required reading at the War College. But what nobody in that room knew, including my father, was what I'd discovered in Mom's hidden letter would change everything I thought I knew about these 22 years. I felt the shift in the room around me and could practically hear the mental recalculations happening. Sarah Beth Morrison, the Morrison girl who'd run off to join the army against her father's wishes, was apparently someone important enough that regional directors of major corporations were actively trying to recruit her. Pastor William stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "Beth, honey, I had no idea. When Jim says Bronze Star, it's awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat," I said quietly. "But I also have a Defense Meritorious Service Medal and a Combat Action Badge. The real honor was serving with soldiers who deserved those recognitions more than I did." Jim shook his head firmly. "Don't be modest, Colonel. I've read your commendation letters. You saved lives, built critical infrastructure, and revolutionized how we think about forward operating base security." He turned to address the growing crowd. "Your hometown produced a genuine war hero, and you should all be proud." The word hero made me uncomfortable the way it always did, but I caught sight of my father across the room staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His weathered face was cycling through confusion, pride, and something that might have been regret. "I didn't serve for recognition," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I served because someone has to. Because freedom isn't free and somebody has to pay the price for it." "And you paid it in ways most people can't imagine," Jim said solemnly. 3 combat deployments, living in conditions that would break most people, carrying responsibility for soldiers' lives. That takes a special kind of person. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing about Colonel Morrison, Aunt Linda approached me with an envelope. "Your mother made me promise to give this to you," she whispered. Inside was a truth that would shatter every assumption I'd held about my family. I stared at the envelope in Linda's hands, my name written in Mom's careful script across cream-colored paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges. The sight of her handwriting, those familiar loops and careful crosses on her T's, made my throat close up completely. "She gave this to me 3 years ago," Linda said quietly, settling into the pew beside me as the last mourners filed out. "Made me promise to keep it safe to give it to you if—" She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. My hands shook as I took the envelope. Through the paper I could feel multiple pages folded inside, substantial enough to suggest this wasn't just a brief note. I hesitated suddenly, afraid of what I might find. What if it was a disappointment? What if even in death she couldn't forgive me for staying away? "She wrote it after your promotion to lieutenant colonel made the county paper," Linda added softly. "She called me crying that day, happy tears," she said. "Proud tears." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages filled with Mom's familiar handwriting. My eyes went to the salutation. "My dearest Beth, my brave girl. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to hold your hand when you came home, and I'm sorry for all the years I let silence answer when I should have been the one to speak first. I need you to know that every single day for 22 years I have been proud of you. When you made second lieutenant, I bought 5 copies of the paper and hid them in my sewing box. When you earned your Bronze Star, I cried in the grocery store parking lot, not from sadness, but from bursting with pride that I couldn't share at home. I had to stop reading my vision blurring with tears that I'd been holding back since I walked into this church." Linda handed me a tissue without saying anything, her own eyes wet. "I kept everything, sweetheart. Every article about your deployments, every promotion announcement, every letter you sent that David intercepted. Yes, I know about those. I found them in his desk drawer 2 years ago when I was looking for stamps. He thought he was protecting family unity, but he was just protecting his father's pride." My blood went cold. David had been intercepting my letters. All those times I'd written home, pouring my heart out to Mom, apologizing for missing holidays, trying to explain why I'd chosen service over family traditions, and she'd never received them. I called you from the payphone at Miller's Grocery every Tuesday when your father was at his poker game. Those were the happiest hours of my week, hearing about your life, your soldiers, your work building bridges, and bringing clean water to places that needed hope. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Those Tuesday evening calls, always at 7:30, always brief but warm. Mom asked about my deployments, my health, my soldiers. I'd always wondered how she got away from Dad for those conversations. I know you probably think I chose him over you, but that's not what happened. I chose survival over confrontation, and I chose loving you quietly over not loving you at all. Maybe that was cowardly. Maybe I should have packed a bag and followed you when you were 18. Please don't think you failed me by staying away. You succeeded at becoming everything I hoped you'd be: strong, principled, brave enough to choose your own path. I failed you by not being brave enough to choose mine. I folded the letter carefully, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not the sharp crack of anger I'd expected, but something quieter and more complete. Understanding, maybe. Or forgiveness, not just for her, but for all of us who'd been trapped in Dad's version of how families should work. She used to take her car to the AutoZone parking lot sometimes, Linda said quietly, when she wanted to call you, but the house phone felt too risky. She'd sit there for an hour afterward, just smiling. David intercepted my letters. I said, my voice hollow with realization. Linda nodded. She confronted him about it. Big fight. He said he was trying to keep the family from falling apart completely, that your letters just made her sadder. She made him promise to stop, but... She shrugged helplessly. But what Mom's letter revealed something else, something about David that would force me to confront my brother, and what he told me would change how I saw our entire childhood. For 22 years, I'd carried the weight of thinking I'd been rejected, abandoned, written off as a disappointment. But Mom's words revealed the truth. I'd been loved fiercely, constantly, just silently. She'd been proud of every promotion, worried about every deployment, celebrated every achievement from the shadows. The chapel was empty now, except for Linda and me. Through the tall windows, I could see people gathering in the parking lot, Dad and David standing near the hearse with the funeral director. In a few minutes, we'd all caravan to Millbrook Cemetery for the graveside service. But first, I needed to have a conversation with my brother that was 22 years overdue. I stood up, tucking Mom's letter carefully into my dress blue jacket pocket close to my heart. Linda, thank you for keeping this, for loving her enough to be her secret keeper. She squeezed my hand. She loved you so much, Beth. Never doubt that. Armed with Mom's truth, I walked toward the parking lot where David stood with his family. It was time for a conversation 22 years in the making, one that would either destroy what was left of our relationship or rebuild it from the ground up. The parking lot was buzzing with quiet conversations as people prepared for the procession to the cemetery. I spotted David standing beside his SUV, helping his youngest son adjust his tie, while Karen organized flowers in the back seat. He looked up as I approached, something in his expression shifting when he saw my face. Beth, he said quietly, straightening up. How are you holding up? We need to talk, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. Privately. Karen looked between us, sensing the tension. Boys, get in the car, she said quickly, ushering her sons into the back seat. David, I'll meet you at the cemetery. After she drove away, David and I stood alone beside his truck. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. You look good in uniform, he said awkwardly. I mean, you look official, important. I know about the letters, David. His face went pale. The careful composure he'd maintained all morning cracked, and I saw the same expression I remembered from childhood David caught doing something he knew was wrong. What letters? He asked weakly, but we both knew he was just buying time. Every letter I wrote to Mom, every attempt to stay connected to this family. She found them in your desk drawer 2 years ago. I pulled Mom's letter partially from my pocket. She wrote about it. She knew David. He leaned against his truck, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. "Beth, I can explain." "Then explain," I said. "Explain why you threw away 22 years of my attempts to come home." David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. "I was 20 years old when you left." 20. "Do you remember what this house was like after you were gone?" I didn't answer, waiting for him to continue. "Dad was impossible to live with for months. He'd snap at everything, throw things when your name came up. Mom cried herself to sleep every night for the first year. And me, I was just trying to survive in the middle of it all, trying to hold together what was left of this family." "So you decided to make sure I stayed gone?" "I decided to protect what we had left." The words exploded out of him. Then he immediately looked around to make sure no one had heard. "Every letter you sent made Mom sadder. She'd read them and cry for hours, then Dad would get angry at her for crying and they'd fight. I thought if the letters stopped coming, maybe she'd start healing." "That wasn't your choice to make." "I was a kid, Beth. I was 20 years old, watching my family fall apart, and I made the best decision I could with what I knew." His voice cracked. "I was scared that if I supported you, he'd kick me out too. I had nowhere else to go. No college fund, no trust fund, just this family and Dad's business." The raw honesty in his voice cut through my anger. I remembered David at 20, barely out of high school, suddenly thrust into the role of family peacekeeper after I'd blown everything apart by leaving. "I used to hide in the garden behind the church," he continued, his voice getting quieter. "Remember that time Dad threw his coffee mug because you asked if girls could be engineers? You grabbed my hand and we ran back there and you told me we'd build a fort where dads couldn't throw things." I did remember. I was 8. David was 11. We'd spent the afternoon gathering branches and creating an elaborate hideout. "You taught me how to throw a football that day," I said softly. "Said if I was going to be weird about wanting to build things, at least I should be able to throw like a real Morrison. I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how. Make you fit in better so Dad wouldn't get so angry." David's voice was thick with regret. "But I was just a kid too, trying to survive in a house where love felt conditional." We stood with that truth for a moment. 2 children who'd been forced to navigate an impossible situation, making survival decisions that would echo for decades. "The construction company isn't doing well," David said, suddenly changing the subject, but not really. "We're barely keeping our heads above water. 3 generations of Morrison construction, and I'm about to be the one who runs it into the ground. Why are you telling me this? Because I spent 22 years being the successful son, the one who stayed home and took care of business. But you know what? I never learned how to lead, only how to follow Dad's orders and try not to disappoint him. You left and built something amazing. I stayed and watched everything crumble." There it was, the truth we'd been dancing around. David hadn't just been protecting the family, he'd been protecting his position as the favored son. But that position had become a prison. "Who came with you today?" David asked suddenly. "Jim mentioned a +1 on your RSVP. Sergeant Major Carlos Torres, my former first sergeant from Afghanistan. He saved my life in Kandahar when our convoy hit an IED. He's been more of a father to me over the past 15 years than Dad ever was." David was quiet for a long moment. "You found a real family." "I found people who chose to love me for who I am, not who they needed me to be." But David's honesty was healing, but there was still one more secret hidden in our family home, one that would give me the power to finally confront Dad on equal terms. 3 days later, David called with urgency in his voice that immediately put me on alert. After 22 years in the military, I'd learned to recognize when someone was operating under stress. "Beth, we need to talk about Mom's will," he said without preamble. "Dad's been acting strange since the service. He keeps saying he can't find some papers, but he won't tell me what papers. And the lawyer called asking about probate, but Dad hung up on him." I was sitting in my hotel room trying to decide whether to extend my leave or return to Fort Leonard Wood. The conversation with David in the parking lot had left me emotionally drained, but oddly hopeful. For the first time in decades, we'd talk to each other like siblings instead of strangers. "What kind of papers?" I asked. "That's just it, he won't say. But he's been going through every drawer, every filing cabinet, every box in the house. He looks panicked. I've never seen him like this." An hour later, I found myself standing in the driveway of the house where I'd grown up. It looked smaller than I remembered, the white paint peeling slightly around the windows, Mom's flower beds overgrown with weeds that nobody had bothered to tend since she got sick. Dad's truck wasn't in the driveway. David had mentioned he'd been spending most of his time at the construction office since the funeral, avoiding the house where Mom's absence felt most real. I used the key David had given me, the same spare key I'd returned 22 years ago when I left for basic training. The silence inside was deafening. Everything looked exactly the same, as if time had stopped the day I left. Mom's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her coffee mug, the one with the faded roses, sat in the sink unwashed. David was in Dad's study, sitting at the old oak desk with a pile of papers spread in front of him like a war room briefing. "Any luck?" I asked. He shook his head, frustrated. "Bank statements, insurance documents, the deed to the house tax records going back 20 years, but no will. It's like it doesn't exist. Or like someone's been hiding it." I started searching systematically, using the methodical approach the military had taught me. Filing cabinets first, then desk drawers, then the old safe in the closet, where Dad kept what he considered his most important documents. Nothing. "Wait," I said, remembering something. "When I was 12, Mom reorganized her sewing cabinet. She made me help her sort through all her patterns and fabric. She said she was creating a special place for her most precious things." We found Mom's sewing cabinet in the spare bedroom, exactly where it had always been. The bottom drawer was locked, but David found the key taped to the underside of the cabinet. Classic, Mom always practical about hiding things. Inside was a sealed legal envelope marked "Personal, Margaret Morrison," in her careful handwriting. "Found it," I called. David came over as I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was Mom's last will and testament, properly notarized and witnessed, dated 6 months before she died. I scanned the contents quickly, my heart pounding as I read. "What does it say?" David asked quietly. "She left you the family business," I said, slowly, still processing. "Your share of Dad's construction company plus her savings account." I kept reading, my breath catching. "And she left me the house. The house plus her life insurance policy, $50,000. I looked up at David, seeing my own shock reflected in his face. "She left Dad nothing except his personal belongings." David stared at the document like it might burst into flames. "That's not possible. They were married for 43 years. Wives don't just cut their husbands out of their wills." But the accompanying letter made everything clear. I opened it with trembling hands and began reading Mom's explanation. "To my children, David and Beth. If you're reading this, your father has probably hidden this will from you both. I'm giving you what Bob never could, a foundation to build the life you choose. David, the business is yours to run as you see fit without your father's interference. The savings account should be enough to modernize the equipment and expand into the green construction methods you've always wanted to try. Beth. I'm leaving you the house, not because I think you'll live in it, but because I want you to have a home base, a place that's yours by right and not by permission. The insurance money is seed money for whatever dream you're building, whatever mission you're called to serve." The front door slammed, making us both jump. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and Dad appeared in the doorway of the study, his face flushed with anger and what looked like panic. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he demanded, then stopped dead when he saw the papers in my hands. His face went completely pale. "Where did you find that Mom's sewing cabinet?" I said quietly, where she knew we'd look. Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "That's not legal." She was sick, confused. "She couldn't have—" "It's dated 6 months before she died, Dad. She was perfectly lucid, and it's properly witnessed and notarized." She was my wife. The words exploded out of him with 22 years of pent-up frustration. 43 years, she can't just... She can and she did, I said, standing up with the will still in my hands. She gave us what you never could, freedom to choose our own paths without your approval. Dad's admission was just the beginning. What I decided to do with Mom's inheritance would either drive us apart forever or create something beautiful from the ashes of our broken family. 6 months later, I stood in the front yard of what had once been the Morrison family home, watching a crew hang a wooden sign above the front porch, Millbrook Veterans Transition Center, serving those who served. The answer to what I'd do with Mom's inheritance had come to me gradually, not in a flash of inspiration, but through quiet conversations with Torres, through sleepless nights thinking about Mom's letter, through the realization that I'd spent 22 years running from home when what I really needed was to redefine what home meant. I'd taken a 6-month leave from active duty to oversee the conversion. The house now contained a counseling center in what used to be the living room job training computers in the old dining room, and a family mediation space in Mom's former sewing room. The basement had been converted into a meeting hall, where veterans could gather, where spouses could find support, where the invisible wounds of service could finally be acknowledged and treated. "Colonel Morrison," a young voice called from behind me. I turned to see Emma, one of the neighborhood kids who'd become fascinated with the project. "Sergeant Major Torres said you'd teach us how to fold the flag for Memorial Day." "Absolutely," I said, pulling the ceremonial flag from its case. "But first, do you know why we fold it in triangles?" As I began the demonstration showing Emma and her friends the precise movements that turned fabric into symbols, I noticed Dad approaching from across the street. He'd been coming by every day since the center opened, initially suspicious, then curious, now genuinely helpful. The transformation in my father had been the most surprising part of this entire journey. It started when he met Torres, who'd driven down from Detroit to help with the center's setup. Torres had a gift for drawing stories out of people, and somehow he'd gotten Dad talking about his own father's service in Korea, about the nightmares that had haunted their house throughout Dad's childhood. "I thought if I made military service seem shameful, you'd choose something safer," Dad had confided to Torres one evening while they worked on installing new flooring. "I watched my father come back from war, broken, drinking himself to death, jumping at every car backfire. I was trying to protect you from what broke him, but all I did was break us instead." Torres had nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd seen combat trauma in multiple generations. "Fear makes us do stupid things sometimes, Bob. The trick is learning from the stupid things instead of doubling down on them." David had surprised everyone by volunteering his construction crew for the renovation, refusing payment, and hiring 3 veterans as permanent employees. The center had become his testing ground for the green construction methods Mom had mentioned in her letter: solar panels, energy-efficient systems, sustainable materials. "Turns out Beth wasn't the only one who needed to learn how to build something meaningful," he'd told me with a smile that reminded me of the brother I'd loved as a child. The real breakthrough had come when Dad started attending the evening support groups. Not as a veteran he'd never served, but as a family member trying to understand military culture. He'd listened to stories from wives whose husbands had PTSD, from children whose parents had deployed multiple times, from veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. "I spent 40 years thinking military service was something that happened to other people's families," he'd said to me one evening as we painted the meeting room. "I never understood that you weren't just playing soldier, you were serving something bigger than yourself." The Memorial Day ceremony was Jim Patterson's idea. He'd not only donated the construction materials through his company, but had also convinced several local businesses to participate. Now the center served as headquarters for an annual celebration that honored all veterans, not just the ones who'd made it home. Local businesses had stepped up in ways I'd never expected. Miller's Grocery, where Mom used to make her secret phone calls, now offered a military discount year-round. The auto shop hired 2 recent veterans. Even Pastor Williams had started including prayers for deployed service members in Sunday services. "Beth," Dad said, approaching with a handful of small American flags for the children. Torres wants to know if you're ready for the procession. Almost, I said, finishing the flag folding demonstration with Emma. 13 folds, and each one represents something important to our country. As I handed the perfectly triangulated flag to Emma, I caught Dad watching with an expression I'd never seen before: pride, but also something deeper. Understanding, maybe. The recognition that his daughter had spent 2 decades serving something larger than family drama and small-town expectations. You know, he said quietly as the children ran off to show their parents the flags they'd learned to fold, your mother would have loved this. Seeing the house full of people, seeing you teaching those kids, seeing all of us working together. She would have loved seeing us talk to each other like family, I said. He knotted his throat, working with emotion he was still learning how to express. I spent so many years being angry about what I thought I'd lost, that I never saw what you'd become. The center was bringing our community together, but the real test would come on Memorial Day, when I'd have to face the entire town in my uniform standing beside the father who'd once banned me from Mom's funeral. Memorial Day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring morning that Mom had always loved for her garden work. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my hotel room, adjusting my dress blue uniform for what felt like the most important ceremony of my military career, not because of the honors or recognition, but because it would be the first time in 22 years that Dad and I would stand together publicly as family. The Millbrook Veterans Transition Center had become the rallying point for the entire community's Memorial Day observance. What had started as Jim Patterson's suggestion had grown into something none of us had expected, a genuine celebration that brought together veterans from 3 wars, active duty families, and civilians who'd never truly understood military service until now. I arrived at the center to find Torres already organizing the color guard, his command presence, as sharp at 62 as it had been when he was keeping young soldiers alive in Afghanistan. He'd driven down from Detroit the night before, bringing with him 2 other veterans who'd heard about our program through military networks. "Morning, Colonel," he said with the easy familiarity of someone who'd seen me at my worst and helped me become my best. "You ready for this? Ready as I'll ever be?" I replied, watching through the window as families began gathering on the front lawn. Children clutched small flags while their parents set up folding chairs in neat rows facing the makeshift podium we'd constructed on the front porch. Dad arrived exactly at 9, as punctual as always, carrying a wreath he'd made himself from flowers in Mom's garden. He'd spent the past week learning about military protocol from Torres, asking careful questions about proper etiquette, the significance of different ceremonies, the weight of what we were trying to accomplish. "Beth," he said, approaching with something that looked like nervousness. "I wanted to give you this before we start." He handed me a small, worn photograph, Mom, in her Sunday dress, standing next to a much younger version of myself in my brand-new dress blues from my commissioning ceremony. I'd had no idea he'd even taken the picture, let alone kept it. "She made me promise to frame it," he said quietly, "but I was too angry then to keep promises. I found it in her jewelry box last week." My throat tightened as I looked at the image, Mom's face absolutely radiant with pride, my own young face serious with the weight of new responsibility. "Dad, No," he interrupted gently. "Let me say this. I've been practicing with Torres." He took a breath. "I spent 22 years being angry at the wrong person. I was angry at myself for not being the father you needed, so I made you the villain instead. That was wrong. You deserved better from me, and I'm sorry." The crowd was gathering around us now. Neighbors, church members, local business owners, families with teenagers who were considering military service. I could see Mrs. Henderson setting up a refreshment table, Uncle Dave helping elderly veterans find seats, David and his family claiming spots in the front row. Pastor Williams stepped up to the podium to open the ceremony with a prayer that acknowledged all who serve, all who sacrifice, and all who love someone in uniform. As he spoke, I noticed Jim Patterson arriving with several colleagues from the construction company, their presence lending an official weight to the proceedings. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium feeling the weight of every eye in the crowd. These were people who'd known me as a child, who'd watched me leave under a cloud of family disapproval, who'd only recently learned that the Morrison girl had become someone worthy of respect. 22 years ago, I left Millbrook as a teenager with big dreams and bigger fears. I began, my voice carrying clearly across the lawn. I thought I was running away from something. It took me 2 decades to realize I was running toward something, toward service, toward purpose, toward the kind of family that chooses you based on character instead of blood. I paused, looking directly at Dad, who was standing at attention, despite never having served a day in uniform. But the most important thing I've learned is that family isn't just about who raised you, it's about who stands with you when it matters. Today, I'm honored to stand with veterans who bled alongside me in foreign countries, with a father who's learning that love means letting people choose their own paths, and with a community that's decided military families are their families too. The applause was warm and sustained, but what mattered most was the look on Dad's face. Not pride in my accomplishments, but pride in who I'd become as a person. Torres took the podium next, reading the names of local veterans who'd died in service. The list was longer than I'd expected, including men I'd gone to high school with, fathers of kids I'd played with as a child. As each name was read, a family member stepped forward to place a small flag in the memorial garden we'd planted, where Mom's rose bushes used to grow. When the formal ceremony ended, something beautiful happened that no one had planned. Instead of dispersing immediately, people lingered. Veterans found each other and started sharing stories. Teenagers approached active-duty families to ask about military careers. Children played between the memorial flags, while their parents discussed everything from deployment schedules to VA benefits. "Beth," Emma tugged on my sleeve, "will you teach us to fold flags every year?" "Every year." I promised, looking around at the community that had grown from one family's long-overdue healing. As the sun climbed higher and the informal conversations continued, I realized we'd created something that Millbrook had never had before: a bridge between military and civilian communities, a place where service was understood and honored, where family meant more than just shared genetics. As the crowd dispersed, Dad and I walked the familiar path to Millbrook Cemetery. At Mom's headstone, we'd finally say the words that had been 22 years in the making, words that would determine whether we were truly family or just strangers sharing a last name. The walk to Millbrook Cemetery felt different this time, not the solitary march of a rejected daughter, but the measured pace of 2 people who'd finally learned how to be in each other's presence without armor. Dad carried the wreath he'd made from Mom's garden white roses, and Baby's breath arranged with the careful precision of someone who'd never done such work before but wanted to get it right. "She would have loved today," he said as we approached her headstone, which now sat in the shadow of a small oak tree that hadn't been there 22 years ago. Someone, probably David, had been maintaining the grave, keeping the grass trimmed, replacing flowers when the seasons changed. "She would have loved seeing us here together," I replied, kneeling to place my hand on the warm granite. The stone was simple, elegant. Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, beloved wife and mother, 1962 to 2024. Dad knelt beside me, his arthritic joints protesting the movement but his determination overriding the discomfort. For a moment, we both just sat there in the afternoon sun. 2 people who'd spent more than 2 decades learning how to love each other wrong, finally ready to try, learning how to love each other right. "I need to tell you something," Dad said, his voice carrying the careful weight of words he'd been rehearsing. "About your grandfather, my father." I waited, sensing this was important. "He came back from Korea in 1953, and he never really came home, if you know what I mean. Nightmares every night, couldn't hold a job, drank himself to sleep most evenings. My mother spent 20 years trying to put him back together, and it never worked." Dad's hands worked nervously with the wreath ribbon. "I watched what that war did to him, and I swore I'd never let it happen to my children. So when I wanted to enlist, I panicked," he admitted. "All I could see was you coming back broken like he was, and I thought if I made it shameful enough, scary enough, you'd choose something safer." He looked at me directly. "I was trying to save you from his fate, but I was too stupid and scared to ask what you actually wanted." The pieces of our family puzzle were finally clicking into place. Dad's rigid control, his horror at my military aspirations, his inability to see past his own fears, it had all been driven by love. Just love expressed so poorly that it looked like rejection. "What changed?" I asked. "What made you finally understand Torres?" Dad said simply. "That first night he was here working on the center, he told me about his daughters. 3 girls all grown now. One's a doctor, one's a teacher, one's a software engineer. And he said the hardest thing about being a military father wasn't the deployments or the danger, it was learning to trust that he'd raised them well enough to make their own choices." Dad stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. He said, "Bob, your daughter spent 22 years proving she could handle anything the world threw at her. Maybe it's time you started believing in what you helped create." The afternoon was growing late, golden light filtering through the oak leaves above us. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of Millbrook going about its Sunday evening routine, children calling to each other in backyards, the distant hum of lawnmowers, the comfortable noise of a small town settling into evening. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Dad said quietly. "I'm asking you to let me earn back the right to be your father." I looked at this man who'd spent decades locked in his own fear, who was finally learning to see beyond his own pain. "Dad, you never lost that right. You just forgot how to use it." His eyes filled with tears, the first I'd ever seen from him. "I wasted so much time being afraid of losing you that I threw you away instead." "But I came back," I said simply. "And I'm not going anywhere." We placed the wreath together, our hands touching, as we arranged it carefully against the headstone. As we stood back, I noticed other families scattered throughout the cemetery, tending graves, sharing quiet conversations, continuing the endless human work of loving people, even after they're gone. "The center is going to work," Dad said, watching a young family place flowers on a grave several rows away. "Torres thinks we should apply for federal funding, maybe expand the programs." "What do you think?" "I think your mother left you that house for a reason," he said. "And I think maybe my job now is to help you build whatever comes next, instead of trying to control what you choose to build." As we walked back toward town, the sun setting behind us, I felt something I'd been missing for 22 years, the simple comfort of belonging somewhere, of being part of a story larger than my own struggles and achievements. When we reached Main Street, I noticed Emma and her friends practicing flag folding in the park, their parents watching from nearby benches. Without being asked, Dad walked over and began helping them with the more complicated folds, his big construction worker hands surprisingly gentle with the ceremonial fabric. I stood there watching my father teach neighborhood children about flag protocol, the same man who'd once told me I was disgracing our family name by wearing a uniform. The girl who'd run away at 17 had become the woman who'd run toward service, toward sacrifice, toward the harder work of forgiveness and rebuilding. And in the distance, I could see the Veterans Center lights on in the evening gathering room where Torres was probably leading a support group, where David was likely planning tomorrow's construction schedule, where the work of healing continued one conversation at a time. I was finally home.